Jim is not here today, and we had a chat earlier this week. He and I. He is at his home church, I think, in Ohio, and he was invited to preach. They're doing a series, and I don't know the name of it, but it's all about these kind of influential or important places, kind of throughout the Bible story. And he is saying this morning, and maybe even right now, everyone else got really great sermons in this series. He says, he told me, he goes, I looked at the other sermons that they're doing, some really cool places, Mount Sinai, where God speaks and gives his law to people, Mount Carmel, where the prophet of God has this kind of battle with the false prophets of this other, he goes, and I got the Dead Sea. And I felt bad for him. I did, past tense, as in no longer do. Because I looked earlier this week after we chatted, just to kind of remind myself of what we were doing here, because we're in the midst of a series as well called Promised Land. Jim has done the first several sermons in the series. We're looking at the beginning of the book of Joshua and some really amazing stories in the series. So we talked about how the Promised Land is this place of peace and of joy and of contentment, these things that God promises us, this life that God promises us. And in the first week or two, Jim talked about how oftentimes instead of living this promised life, we end up living off manna instead of feasting from the blessings of God. We wander in the wilderness instead of inhabiting the promised land. And the second week, he talked about how as God charges Joshua, he says, be strong and courageous. It was great. This is wonderful passages. In week 3, he talked about Rahab and that story, and I was just frankly pleased I didn't have to talk about Rahab on Kids Sunday again. But it's a great story. And then last week, the story about crossing the Jordan and how God does miracles for his people, and if he's done it once, he'll do it again. And next week, he gets to talk about Jericho. These are all wonderful stories. So I flipped through. Let's just see, what do I got this week? In between the river, Jordan, and Jericho. Oh, good. Mass adult circumcision. Yeah, really think about that. Take a minute. Take all the time you need. Those are not words that one wants to hear. Well, buckle up, I guess. Here we go. I would take the Dead Sea. I bet you all are like, yeah, let's hear that Dead Sea sermon. Okay, here we go. So we're in Joshua chapter 4 and 5, and we've entered the Promised Land, but we haven't yet taken possession of it. They're not yet in control. And this is a weird story, to be sure. I don't think any of you expect on any given Sunday, like, I bet we're going to be edified by a message on circumcision today. But it's a great story, and there are several really helpful, several really important reminders, I think, in this story for us as we begin to experience what Jim has called promised land living, this life of peace and joy and contentment. So there are 3 things that I think we'll find in this story that we need to remember. Things we need to remember if we're going to keep the promised land in perspective. First is this. You need to remember, when you enter the promised land, you need to remember how you got here. So we saw this a little bit. I'm not going to read the whole story, but in chapter 4, starting in verse 5, we hear this. Go over before the ark of the Lord your God, into the middle of the Jordan. So remember, the ark has gone into the Jordan, and they're just standing there because the water has stopped, and they have to wait until everyone has passed by. So before the ark leaves the river, they say, go before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. And throughout the rest of that story, they actually do it twice. They get all the stones, and they actually pile them up in the middle of the Jordan River, right where the priests are standing. And when the waters return, it says, those are still there. The story says that those are still there to this day. They also take 12 of them with them to a place called Gilgal, which we'll see in a little bit, and they stack them up there too. They repeat this command to remember. Because, as we've said a couple times, and as we've already said today, remembering is important. We're forgetful people, I think. I don't remember really. No, we struggle. We struggle in the wilderness. As we wander, as we're trying to make our way to this promised life, we struggle. We have a hard time, and we cry out to God for help through those difficulties. And when God shows up and acts, and we finally make it to the promised land, we finally make it to this life we've been hoping for, and to peace and to joy and to contentment, we say, look what I did. We forget who actually brought us there. It's my biggest accomplishment in life is my son likes old school Nintendo games. Like, if I've done nothing else right, I've done this. But the number of times, God love him, where he's been struggling through, right? Because all you classic 80s kids know, those games had to be real hard. Real hard. You got to get your money's worth. They want you putting the quarters in the machine, so they've got to make it real difficult. It's hard, and he would get so frustrated. He's like, Dad, I don't know what to do, and I'd tell him, and he'd say, stop talking, and then he'd get it right because I told him what to do, and then he'd say, why did it take you so long to come up with that idea? I'm like, oh my gosh, and he would get it, and he'd beat it, and then you know what he'd do? He'd run to his mother, and he'd say, Mom, I beat the game. I beat it. And I die a little inside every time. But the truth of the matter is this is what we do. We forget. It's our tendency to take credit for the things that God does in our lives sometimes. We ask God to work, and then God works, and we're like, yes, I have done it. Look at this life that I have built for myself. We forget who brought us. And the truth of the matter is, if we forget who brought us to the promised land, we don't get to stay there very long. Because we might arrive at a life that is full of peace and joy and contentment. But then our pride just drags us right back into the wilderness. If we fail to remember who brought us, we don't get to stay. So this is one of the things that this story, these chapters, can remind us of. That when you make it to the promised land, when you make it to this promised life, when God's promises are fulfilled, and they will be, we have to remember who brought us. The second thing is, this is where it gets weird, folks. We have to remember who we belong to. Joshua chapter 5. We get this story, and you are welcome. I will not read the whole thing. Just the important bits. Joshua 5, verse 2 says this, at that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives. Okay, anytime you read the Bible and they're making flint knives, someone's going to be real uncomfortable. Every time, just so you know. Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again. That's a terrifying word. That word, again, is doing a whole lot of heavy lifting, I feel like. This is no good. Again. So we find out, no, it's good, we're fine. We find out what he means by again is God has made a covenant. God has made a covenant with his people. In Genesis, that this is what they should do. God says, I will make you this promise. You will do these things. I will be your God. You will be my people. We have all of this stuff that we may get into that is involved in that promise. And as a part of that covenant, God commands that all the males are circumcised. This happens as they're leaving Egypt. They have been in Egypt for a bazillion years. They get out. God works miraculously. They move through the sea, and to signify that they are a part of God's covenant people, all of the men of fighting age in that story are circumcised. But all of those men have died at this point in the story. If you're unfamiliar with the story of wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites, Turns out, not real great at it. They complain about literally everything. At one point, God miraculously feeds them, and they say, like one chapter later, we're sick of this awful food. You know, the food that God is miraculously providing for them every morning. We're sick of this awful, miraculous food. It would be better if we were back in Egypt. And so all of those people are dead. So none of the people who make their way into the promised land in this story have received the mark of the covenant yet. They haven't done it. None of them were circumcised in the desert. This is what chapter 5 tells us. So this is not a matter of cosmetic surgery. It's a mark of the promise between God and Israel. When God says, I will be your God, you will be my people. When God says, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. When God says, through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. This promise, this covenant that God has made with his people, this is the mark, this is the sign that you belong. Hundreds of years in captivity, 40 years wandering in the wilderness, do not erase that promise. And so, chapter 5 tells us, all the Israelites were circumcised. In, I think it's verse 8, it says something about, this happens, they do this thing, and they stayed in that place until they were all healed. You've got to imagine that was like, someone's like 6 to 8 weeks. I don't know about that. This is, they were there for a minute. And then we get this in verse 9. It says, the Lord said to Joshua, after all this has happened, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So that place has been called Gilgal to this day. Gilgal, Hebrew word that basically means rolled away. The disgrace that you suffered, the injustice that you suffered for centuries is wiped away because you are now again mine. You belong to me again. I am your God. You are my people. You are again marked as my special possession. And we have to remember that. As we make our way into the promised land, as we struggle to make it to this life that God has promised, this life characterized by God's peace and by joy and by contentment. You might hear those three words a bunch today. As we struggle to get there, we remember that God has chosen us, that God has marked us as his. We belong to him. We need to remember that. My dad used to say, remember who you are and remember whose you are. When I was a kid, it irritated the crap out of me. I'm not going to lie. It used to drive me nuts. But as it turns out, parents, those things that drive your kids nuts, probably the things they'll remember. Remember whose you are. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, remember you are not your own. You were bought with a price. We have to remember whose we are if we want to live this promised life. Part of the promised land perspective is remembering who brought us and remember who we belong to. I do wonder, almost as an aside, I guess, if part of this is also remembering the promises that we made. God fulfills God's promises, but very often we have also made promises wandering in the wilderness. One of the Psalms that I read pretty frequently is Psalm 66, and there's a line in it that always sticks out to me. It starts partway through verse 13. It says, I will come to your temple with burnt offerings and fulfill my vows to you, vows that my lips promised and my mouth spoke when I was in trouble. Because that's when we make vows, isn't it? This is when we make promises, when we're wandering. When we get to the promised land, when we experience these lives of promise, peace, joy, contentment, all those things, it can be very easy to forget what we promised, the covenants that we made to God when we were in the wilderness. So part of remembering who we belong to is remembering those vows, remembering those covenants as well. So if we want to enter the promised land and live the promised land life, we have to keep these things in perspective. We have to remember who brought us here. We have to remember who we belong to. And we also have to remember, I think maybe most importantly, we have to remember that the promised land doesn't belong to us. We struggle through the wilderness, and we arrive at this place. At long last, we arrive at this place of peace and joy and contentment. And we've received our reward for sticking it through, and our first instinct, I think, is to stake a claim to that, to plant a flag. My struggles, my reward. This belongs to me. But I don't think that is what the promised land is for. Certainly God promises this land, he promises this life to his people as something that we get to experience and enjoy, but that doesn't make it ours. Look at what happens at the end of chapter 5. Starting in verse 13, it says this, now when Joshua was near Jericho, see, I'm not taking Jim's sermon away from him. We're near Jericho, so we haven't gotten there yet, so this is allowed. When Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. The place where you are standing as holy. This place, this promised land that we receive is designated as holy to the Lord. It is set apart for his use, for his possession, for his purpose. Holy is an odd word. I tell my students at the university all the time. Most of us don't hear the word holy unless it's followed by a four-letter word I ought not say here. This is not a term that we generally use, but I always tell them, if you want to understand what holy means, think about your grandma's china cabinet. And then tell me what would happen if you reheated mac and cheese on one of those plates. Yeah, you know. And I ask my students when they have this very reaction, I say, "Why are you laughing?" And they always say, one of them will say, "Well, that's not what those plates are for." And I say, that's what holy means. It has a purpose, a specific purpose that it is set for. Those plates ain't for mac and cheese. They're set apart. This land, the promised land, isn't for you to claim ownership of. It has a different purpose. It doesn't belong to you. And when we forget this, when we think that the promised land belongs to us, we stop sharing its blessings. And we start building fences. And then those fences turn into walls. And then we put gates in those walls, and we try to decide who gets to come and go. Instead of sharing the blessings of God. The promise that God first gives to his people that says, I will be your God, you will be my people. I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. We love that part. We forget the responsibility part that says, through you, all nations of the world will be blessed. You have those things to share them, not to hoard them to yourselves. We lock them up. We restrict access. We like to draw these lines in the sand that say, you have to stay on that side. I get to live over here in the promised land, in the place where God's blessings show up. And I don't know that this is ever as clear to me as it is every 4 years in the fall. I don't like politics. I don't like political sermons. This is not one of those. This is just what the Bible says about some things. And I'm not here to talk about this candidate or that candidate or this party or that party. I don't care. What I care about is the fact that so very often what we hear this time of year is that if you belong to this political party or that political party, you can't be a Christian. And I'm telling you, that's not faithfulness, that's idolatry. Because you can't say that this human person or this human group is a perfect representation of Jesus and this one ain't. You can't do it. This is why I love this section of Joshua so much. And if I could suggest to anyone a scripture to read over and over and over to yourselves this time of year, it would be this one. We already saw it. Look what he says at the end of 5:13. Joshua went up to him, this angel, And he said, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And he says, "Neither." That doesn't show up on political signs very often. Neither. Neither one. Because, Joshua, it's not about, this belongs to us and it's either my way or the highway, or it's us or them, or me or the enemies. This belongs to God. He says, "Neither. I am here as the commander of the armies of the Lord, and the place where you are standing is designated for God's use, for God's purpose. All those blessings that you enjoy, that life that you have come to experience in the promised land after all that wandering, it is for you to enjoy, but it's not for you to keep to yourself. That also belongs to God." So entering the promised land, we find out, doesn't actually end the journey. We're going through the next chapter in Joshua, and then our series will end. Joshua carries on for several more chapters, and the story of God's people wandering and struggling goes on for book after book after book. This promised land life, these perspectives that we find here in this story will continue to play out over and over and over again, even after the people are in Israel. Entering the promised land doesn't end the journey for the Israelites. It's not the end of the journey for us either. But I hope, weird as it is, that these chapters will remind us of some important truths. As we look to our God to fulfill his promises, as we strive towards this sort of life that he promises for us, that we'll remember these things. We'll remember that those blessings he gives, that life that we strive for, doesn't belong to us. It's not for us to hoard or build walls around, but he gives it because he's faithful, and he gives it so that we can share and bless others with it. I hope that we can remember who we belong to. And I hope we remember how we got here. That we can remember that God is the one who carries us through the wilderness. God is the one who brings us to the promised land. God is the one who provides these blessings and gives us this life so that we can share it with others.